The mid-18th century enhancement of the census register system executed in Sweden revealed a much higher rate of infant mortality in the kingdom than expected. The officials of the period pointed their fingers at the common mothers. To them it seemed obvious that out of carelessness, these cruel, unloving women had refused to breastfeed their offspring. And by doing so, they clearly deliberately had caused remarkable losses to the military and labor reserves of the kingdom. Nationally, the situation varied between regions, whereas some of the grimest rates were experienced in South Ostrobothnia. In southwestern Finland, breastfeeding was the preferred infant feeding method. I have looked at breastfeeding practices in southwestern Finland by analyzing stable isotopes of carbon and nitrogen in archaeological dental remains of 7 individuals from the Holy Trinity Churchyard, Pyhän Kolminaisuuden kirkkomaa, in Rauma. These individuals had been buried in the more affordable plots on the northern parts of the churchyard that were in use mainly in the early 19th century. Judging by the location of their graves, it can be presumed that these individuals represented the low-income families of the town. The method is based on isotopic fractionation of heavier and lighter atoms that causes them to divide differently after metabolic processes. The behavior of the nitrogen atoms bound in protein amino acids is a good example of this. The lighter atoms react faster than the heavier, and as a result are primarily secreted, for example, in urine. As the same process is repeated at every upward step of the food chain, the ratios between the light and heavy atoms in the tissues of the apex predators are totally different from those in producers or prey. Similar effects causing enrichment of the heavier isotopes is observable in tissues of breastfed infants that are developing during the period. The crown of the permanent first molar develops during the typical breastfeeding and weaning period. As dentin is inert tissue, the isotope composition of its collagen reflects the diet consumed during its formation. In addition, teeth tolerate postmortem conditions rather well, and thus keep their secrets for the researchers to unveil even centuries later. Dentin develops from the top of the crown towards the root. According to a rough estimate, each 1 millimeter of first permanent molar dentin takes circa 6 months to form. By comparing the values in subsequent samples, it is possible to trace changes in diet such as those caused by breastfeeding and weaning. Exclusive breastfeeding during the first months causes especially the heavier nitrogen, but to some extent also heavier carbon atoms to enrich in the simultaneously forming dentin next to the occlusal surface of the permanent first molar. When weaning begins some months later, the proportion of the heavier atoms begins to deplete until their amount corresponds to that measured in the tissues of the mother or wet nurse. As in archaeological samples, these values are usually unobtainable. The level of values is typically substituted by population means measured from bulk bone collagen, which reflects the average diet during several years. The values in the dentin segments of all 7 individuals from Rauma formed quite similar patterns. Most notably, the proportion of the heavier nitrogen atoms depleted markedly between the first and fourth segments. The first segment develops approximately during the first half a year, and the values measured in it in all teeth pointed towards initially exclusive breastfeeding. The fourth dentin segment had started to develop sometime before the infant's second birthday, and its values in none of the teeth implied consumption of breast milk. These patterns allow concluding that after the initial exclusive breastfeeding, complementary breastfeeding continued nearly until the end of the second year. These results are in line with the modern recommendations of 6 months of exclusive breastfeeding, followed by supplementary milk meals until the end of the second year. They are even in accordance with the prior understanding based on the historical record that breastfeeding was common in southwestern Finland. As breastfeeding is time-consuming, it is good to acknowledge that the societal role of the mothers in Rauma must have allowed for this. This has not been, nor it currently is, an axiom. Globally, short and even non-existent maternal leaves are still a remarkable hindrance for ideal breastfeeding periods. On the other hand, it has been suggested that particularly in post-medieval Europe, the poorest inhabitants of the larger cities had no choice but to breastfeed, as obtaining animal milk was simply too expensive. People in Rauma, however, were mostly self-sufficient, and in mostly agrarian community, obtaining animal milk would not have been a problem. Thus, low income status of these individuals is likely not an explanation for the long breastfeeding periods. The used method does not reveal whether the consumed breast milk was produced by the subject's own mother or someone else. Even though the use of professional wet nurses must have been relatively rare among common people in Finland, childbed mortality was not uncommon prior to the developments of the modern medicine. A sort of a foster system for orphaned infants could well have been possible. The thus far analyzed sample truly is minuscule and cannot be considered representative of several decades of breastfeeding practices. Unfortunately, studies are time-consuming and the analyses are expensive. The results must be considered preliminary, although the similarity of the results may imply that the schedule indicated by the pattern may have been common among at least the low-income families in the turn of the 19th century Rauma. To conclude, it must be considered that all the studied individuals had survived to adulthood through the dangerous years of childhood, which makes the sample biased. Refusing to breastfeed an infant is potentially a fatal health threat. An upcoming study analyzing the dentin of individuals who died during childhood will very likely reveal a much larger portion of infants who had not been ideally breastfed.